In the previous section, we have seen if somebody clicks on this button, how do you process that event and display a message back to the LWC component. This is what we have done. Now, what we want as a part of this section is, instead of directly asking the user to click on a button, we would take an input from the user. We'll place a text box here where we'll ask the user to enter some information. After entering their name, if they click on this button, that is where what I wanted to do, I wanted to show the text that they've entered with this information. Instead of having this messages coming from JS file, instead what we'll say hello, the name that is coming from the text box there. So if you see here, this is what we are trying to do. Now, whatever this information is coming from this text box, you'll copy that and place it here. When this would happen, when user clicks on this button. All right, so that is what the upgrade that we'll do to this component. Without any delay, let's get started with the build. I'm switching to my VS Code. Now, what is the thing that I want as part of the wireframe that we have discussed? The changes that we need to do on the component is, 1, I need to add a text box. 2, once the user clicks on that button, I need to show a message which says, hello, that person's name. So those are the things that I need to do. Now, if you see here, where do I need to keep this changes? As discussed, this is the place where I need to keep those changes. Now, where do I have this place in my component? So this is that place. So if you see here, this is that place where I'm just making that change. Now what I'll do, I'll just remove this. I'm removing it. So my component is empty. Body that we have for the card is currently empty. If I deploy the changes, all this code, all this static text would be removed. This is the place where I need to take the input followed by display the message, greeting message to the end user. How do we do that? So currently I do not know how do I write the code to get the input from the user. Now what I need to do, again, go back to your component library. For what? For looking the ways to get an input from the user. How do I do that? Simply, since I know the tag that I need to use, I am searching for input. Since I am taking an input, so that gives me the idea of searching for the input here. In case if you do not know, go to the component library, the first page, look for options that you have. All right, is there anything that is matching your requirement? Open your component reference, check the checkbox for the Lightning Web component, so that way we only see the Lightning components here. And if I scroll down, looking for any option that matches my requirement, I got an input base component. I'll open it. So what it says, this component represents interactive control that accepts user input depending on the type attribute. So it is basically meant for taking an input from the end user. Now, if you think about this input, there could be multiple types of input that the user can enter. One could be text, other could be date time as an input, or they can be providing an email address. They can provide us the time, they can provide us the password. All these are all inputs. Now for every input type, there is a special kind of a validation that we need to do. So that is where it is always suggested to check what kind of an input that you're looking for. In my scenario, I'm taking a name of a user, which is of type text. So that is why I'll select this option here. Now, once I've selected this option, you can click on run there. That is where you will be seeing the output in the preview. Now, if you see here, this is the text that it looks like. Now, where can I get the code? I can get the code from here. Now, you might be wondering, where is this a text input field coming from? If you see here, that is coming from here. Now, how do I know that which line of code that I need to copy from this HTML file? If I had that issue of figuring out which code that needs to be copied for my requirement, I would look for the static text that is there. Any English information, English text that is there, I look for that first. Now, if you see here, this is one text that I can see, and this is another line that I can see that is in English. Rest all are in HTML language. Now I'll figure out where is this content in my preview. So this content is in this section. So do I need this one? No, I just need an input field. So where is that other information? How can I figure out this input field in my code? If you see here, that is coming from this line, enter some text. So that means this line is what I need to copy. Now you might be wondering, do I need to copy the div tag? Div tag here is basically providing you this background that is there. How do you figure out? In case if you do not know what exactly this is doing, take the code of this one, deploy to your Salesforce org and see that, or simply remove this div tag here and you should be able to see that changes. If you see here, as soon as I remove the div tag, this is how my input tag looks like. That is how you can figure out which line of code that you need to copy. Even though there are multiple lines of code, we can look for the one that we are interested in, copy that line of code and go ahead with your requirement. If you are wondering why there are lots of code that is there are a couple of options that we have in terms of how this input needs to be displayed. That is why we have corresponding code that is there. Since I'm interested in the basic input here, so I'm just going ahead with this option that I've copied here. Go back to our VS Code and paste it there. Now, where do I need to paste it? I want to put this input tag or input text inside that body. So I'll just paste it here because I know that this section is for the footer, this section is for the body, and this section is basically for the header and everything. Right? So I've made that change. One more thing that I also want to change this icon name as case because we are working on the case record here. Just for our understanding, I'm just changing this icon here as well. I have an input field. The output of this input field label says enter some text. Is that what I wanted to show to the end user? The answer is no. Instead, what I will say, enter your name, because that is what I wanted to take it as an input and display it in the message that I have. Now the user would be entering their input. So let's deploy this component and see how it looks like. I've saved changes here. I'm deploying this code. Deployment is successful. I'll go back to the Salesforce org to a refresh. We have an input field. All the text information, static information that we have, it says this is my first component has been removed because we have removed it from the body. And this is the text field where I can enter some text here. Is anything happening when I do this? The answer is no, nothing is happening. I am just seeing that information being entered under this name. Now, what is our goal? Once somebody enters some information here, upon clicking on this button, I need to display that hello message or welcome or greeting message just below that input field. Now, how do I proceed with it? Now, if you think carefully, the issue that we are interested in here is, or the roadblocks that we have at this point of time that we need to figure out is, how do I get this input value that the user entered into my JS file? Why am I talking about JS file? If I can get it into the JS file, what I can do, once the user clicks on that button, instead of writing this dot message equal to some static text, I can assign that value that I got from the UI back to this message. It is like we taking that from the HTML page. We are taking that input from the HTML page, the value that the user has entered, passing it to the JS file. Once the user clicks on that button, since I have this value in the JS file, I'm setting it to this message. Why am I setting it to the message? Because I know how to pass this value from the JS file back to the HTML file. How can I do that? By simply putting that message variable in a curly braces, where whenever there is a change in that value, the HTML page gets updated where it would display that information. Second piece is also something that we have already tried in our previous section. So all we did was we have created a property called message. To that property called message, we have set some static text. So this time the static text would be replaced from the information that we got from the user. And I'll be updating this as well, saying that hello, the name of the user is what I'll update. But in terms of the technical aspect of it, it is similar to what we have done earlier. So now what is the point of concern? Point of concern is the first one, where I need to understand how do I get this information that has been entered in this input text into my JS file. That is the area that we need to explore. So that way I can say that, okay, if somebody is doing a change on this one, I can ask the system to look for the details. Now, if you see here, I wanted to understand the attributes that are provided to this input. I wanted to see if there is any attribute that helps me, just like this on-click event. So I'm just putting a space here and trying to explore if there are any options that are given to us. If I do a control space, or if I click on this input tag, that is where this ID is smart enough to give me the attributes that are associated to this tag. So what are these attributes? These are the attributes that we have. Now, what am I interested in? I'm interested in an attribute which is on an event change. So if you see here, there are events which are on focus, on change, and on blur. Now, what am I interested in? If somebody is entering some information, that is where there is a change that happens on the text. So that is where I wanted to call a function. That function captures what is the input that the user has entered. So that is why I've selected this on change. On blur is something, an action that triggers when the event is released the focus. On focus is an event that gets fired. The action triggers when the element receives the focus. So those are not the things that I'm looking at, because I'm interested in more on the what has been entered at the user level. Now I'll go ahead and use that on change. And as we know that whenever there is an event that is there, we wanted to call a function. Do I have any function in my JS file? The answer is no. So that is why I've kept the curly braces here. Go back to the JS file and I'll just copy this function that I have to create a new function that would be listening to this on change event. So what I'll do, I'll go back to the JS file. Instead of saying handle click, handle, I'll say on change input. So this is what I'll say. Instead of writing handle click, I'll say handle on change input field or input text field. Input text. Right. So this is what I've done. Now I'll save this one. I have a function that is listening to this on change event. Since I have the name of that function, I can go to the HTML file and paste it here. Now, when somebody enters some text, because of this on change event being fired, it would be calling this function. And this function would be listened by this function that I've declared here. Just like how I did earlier, I'll just remove this code, which is not needed. And then I'll say console.log inside this function that we are looking at. Again, do a simple deployment to test if it is working. The reason why I'm doing this one is when it comes to your LWC component building or any component that you're building using Aura or your Visualforce pages, it is always recommended to do a step-by-step approach. So that way it would be easier for you to figure out what has been breaking if something is going wrong. So you can revert back to the previous changes that was working and look for why is this component stopped working because of me adding this extra line. All right, so this is the step-by-step approach that I would suggest when it comes to building your LWC or Aura components. Since I have written a console log to show you the event that has been fired on change of this text field, and that has been listened by a function called handle on change input text as a function name. Right, so what I'll do, I'll just enter some text here. I'll simply say test. And as soon as I do that, I can see a console log being printed. And this is coming from which function? Handle on change input text. If I keep on adding some text here, it gets called those many times. So now what is happening whenever I am just making that change, this function has been called. Now what I'm interested in, I'm not interested in this console log. I'm interested in this value that has been entered by the user. Now how do I get this one? I'll go back to my VS Code. Instead of printing this one, what I would do, I'll just add this line, event dot target dot value. I've just written extra line here. I'll save this change and deploy this once more. You'll get to know what exactly this line would do once we test it from the UI. Our deployment was successful. Let's go back to the UI, refresh it. This time, same component. From the UI perspective, we have not made any change, but from the logic perspective, we have added something that we wanted to test. So if I hit T here, it says inside the handle on click input text, and there is a T that has been entered here. If I keep on adding some text here, that is where this value gets updated. So if I do that again, you'll be able to see that value coming up here. Now what it helps us understand is that event.triggered.value is getting the value that has been entered on the input field. So whatever the user is entering, I'm getting this value getting updated. Now, since I have shown you that this is getting me the value, what I can do, I can use this value to say that this is what the user has entered. For that, what I'll just do, I'll just take this message variable that I have, because that is what I'm printing at the end. So I'll say simply dot message dot this and pass this value that I'm getting here. How do I do that? I'll just simply copy paste it and put a semicolon. If you see, the syntax of your JavaScript is closer to your Apex language, and the syntax of your HTML is close to your Aura or your VF page development, right? So that is an indication that you can take in terms of if anything that you wanted to remember or anything, you can find the relevance in terms of comparing your JS with your Apex language. It is close to that, and your HTML is closer to your HTML language or any front-end concepts that you have learned in the Salesforce. Now, I've made that change. What I'll do, so I've set this value that I'm getting from the front end to this message variable. And if I look at from the HTML side, this component or this HTML file doesn't have any reference of this message that has been used, right? So I'm populating something in the background, but I'm not displaying that in the front end. So I've removed that message that we had earlier as a part of our updating of our HTML side. So that is why I've put back that message variable again. I've also used a break statement at the end, so that way this message comes in a new line rather than continuing on the same line that we have on the input side. So I'll deploy this latest changes. The deployment has been completed. I'll go back to the Salesforce org, refresh it. And this time, if I enter some information, what is happening, as soon as I do it, it is getting updated here. Right? So if I remove something, it is getting updated. If I'm saying hello, getting updated here. Now, is that what I want? The answer is no. I want somebody to click on this button that should update that message which says hello, that username. If my username is SFDC quest, it should say hello SFDC quest. Right now, what is happening? Whatever that I enter here is been updated here, and I'm not clicking on this button yet. If I click on this button, the previous code that I have or previous static information that I have is been overriding the value that I have here. Now, how do I fix this one? I'll again go back to my VS Code to see what is happening here. If I go to my JS file, as soon as I have the value that the user is entering, I'm directly setting to this message variable. Since I'm directly setting to this message variable is updated. So that is why we see the changes immediately. Is that the thing that I want? The answer is no. I want this message to be displayed to the end user with the hello in front of the name that they have entered when user clicks on the button. That means this action of setting the message should happen once the user clicks on this button. So that means this function needs to be called. So once this function has been called, I need to set that value here. What is the value that I wanted to set? Instead of saying this message is coming from JS file, I'll say hello. Hello. And I want to display their name. Right now, I do not know what is their name, right? So I'm just putting a placeholder here. It is not the tag that I'm writing. I'm just using this to indicate that there is a placeholder, and followed by exclamation mark. I just want this exclamation mark to be displayed. Now, how do I get this name here? I can get the name that has been entered by the user by using this event.target.value, but how do I use it here? So these are two different functions. Now, how do I mix them? So that is where I can go ahead and take a temporary variable. I'll go ahead and take a temporary property. I'll set that as blank. So once I have the temporary property, instead of setting this to the message that I have, I'll set to this message, temporary message that I have. Instead of asking the system to directly making a change on the message variable, I'll take a temporary variable called temp message, and I'm assigning whatever the user has entered into this temporary variable. Now, since the temporary variable is there, I can access it from this function also. Instead of writing it as placeholder, I'll just replace it with temp message. So as soon as I use the suggestion that has been provided by the VS Code, it is updated as this dot message. So that means it is just pointing to this property that I have. So once done, I have everything ready, and this message variable does not need to change because this is the message that we are sending at the end once the user clicks on this button. Let's do a deployment of this component once more to see the changes. Deployment is successful. Let's go back to our page, Salesforce org, refresh it once more. So at this point of time, we do not have any message here, right? So let's say SFDC request. I see the changes happening here. At this point of time, nothing has been displayed yet. If I click on this button, that is where it says hello SFDC quest with an exclamation mark at the end. Now, if I change this value to Salesforce and click on this button, that is where it gets updated. But if I remove it and say hello world, this the first program that we would write, and if I click on display message, it says hello world, right? So that is how your component is able to listen to it is able to take an input from the user, and upon doing an action, we are updating something on the component itself. So this example would help us understand few things. Now, what are those things? From this exercise, we have understood how to take an input from the user. So this is how we take the input from the user. Now, when the user is entering something, we are able to listen to the events using our JS file, using onChange event. We are able to listen to that events that have been firing. So that way we are able to get this value that has been entered into this text field. Now, post that, once the user interacts with this button by clicking on this button, we are able to listen to the event called onClick event. Because of that, we are able to call a function. Using that function, whatever the value that we have, we are modifying that value because we are not directly showing it. We are adding hello in front of it and exclamation marks at the end and displaying that information in between. So these are all the things that we have learned as a part of this exercise. Mostly we have understood how is this HTML file communicating with your JS file, and we have also understood one more important concept of how do I pass that information that is there in the JS file back to the UI. How did we do that? We have done that using our property called message in this example. So that brings us to the end of this section where we have looked at how to take an input from the end user, We have also looked at how do I process that input that entered by the user using my JS file, and we have sent that input back to the UI so that way my LWC component has been updated.
Hey guys, if you like this video, do like, share and subscribe to SFDC Quest.